Hello everyone, welcome back to VENKANNA ENGLISHGURU. Friends, we have started a topic called History of American Literature. So we had only just one class with regard to History of American Literature. Today we are going to have a second important class about American literature. Friends, we discussed the concept of American literature actually sub-classified based on different historical incidents by a number of historians. And the major historical incidents that influenced further classification of American literature were four major important revolutions. And the first one was a Revolutionary War that took place during 1775 and 81. And the second one, the Civil War, very, very important one. And this created a lot of changes, and I'll give you a lot of inputs with regard to the Civil War, because this is the major important war with regard to American literature, so that you can understand the major broad themes of it. Is just like Renaissance. It is just like Romanticism that took place in English literature. So, and what actually happened during Civil War and before and after. So we'll have a very lengthy discussion in future. Next, World War One and World War Two. These are the major important incidents, according to historians, that paved a way to for the classification of periods and themes and other issues with regard to American literature. And friends, we discussed what are the major important periods of this American literature. So there are six major important periods of this American literature, and the first one is the colonial period. And the first one is the colonial period 1607. So the concept of American literature only began the year 1607. This is very important. And whereas English literature, which became popular only in 450 AD, because we have gone through. And the second one, early national period, 1775 and 1865. Very, very important period. And the realistic period, 1865, 1900, naturalistic period, 1900 and 1914, modernism, 1914 to 39, contemporary period of American literature, 1939 onwards. Friends, today in our discussion, and this, as you know, I'm not going to talk about it, and you're all aware about it. And today we are going to have a discussion with regard to some basic knowledge with regard to the colonial period of American literature. So the colonial period, as you know, the period from 1607 to 1775. So America, when it actually became free and got independence in 1775, and before that, the period from 1607 to 1775, nearly 70 years and 170 years. This period is considered to be the colonial period. And England and America, which is actually colonized by Britishers and the Europeans, hence America during this period, it was called New England. Friends, you need to remember this word, New England. New England refers to America. New England, which means most of the Americans, they were actually migrated from European countries and the Spain, English, and other part of European world. That is what America was actually called New England at the time. And till modern period also, it was referred New England, which means USA or UK. So the colonial period, 1607 to 1775. And friends, and what are the major important literary events that took place? Who are the popular writers of the time? Most of the times when you observe UGC or set-net question papers, there is a term like slave narratives. So a number of bits that you can find based on slave narratives. So the concept of slave narratives became popular only originated during the colonial history of American literature. And there is a writer called Philip Wheatley, very wonderful writer, the 19-year-old writer and African American slave. And he composed a few narratives, and those were considered to be the first African American slave narratives. Slave narrative, it's one of the genres, it's one of the genres, and that became so popular during this particular time. So the colonial period 1607 to 1775. And once we observe this, the oral era from the founding of first settlement Jamestown to the outbreak. First settlement at Jamestown that took place during 1607. From this period to the outbreak of American Revolution. American Revolution began popular, and there was a very popular opposition from the local Americans, and that took place in 1775. The period from this two, which is considered to be the colonial period. And friends, once we look at what was the literature about, okay, whether there were poetry, whether there was novel or fiction or drama, or what was it about? It was about religious. So most of you, as usual, and in English literature, once we observe, and the Old English period from 450 to 1066, most of the literature was about religious. In the same way, the colonial period, literature was all about religious. Literature was all about practical issues. Americans, practicality, this is very important. We'll talk about, there are plenty of terms, transcendentalism, individualism, or else enlightenment. People, we talk about a lot of issues. So Americans are so popular only because of their practicality in nature. So they wrote a lot of literature on practical issues and historical. These are the major important themes of literature that was written during the colonial period 1607, 1775. Remember this. Next, notable 17th century writers of the time. Who are the popular writers in American literature during this colonial period? So, and during this period, you could find journals, you could find narratives. Narratives, friends, you need to understand stories and slave narratives, as I told you. So, autobiographical works. So, popular writers were and William Bradford and John Winthrop, and the theologian who wrote a lot of literature about religious issues, and Cotton Mather. These were the popular writers, William Bradford, John Winthrop, and Cotton Mather. And Jonathan Edwards, another important writer. He was the major philosopher as well as a theologian who also wrote a lot of literature in terms of journals, in terms of narratives. And Jonathan Edwards and Benjamin Franklin, friends, remember. And you might have read a lot of literature about, a lot of ideas about Benjamin Franklin, who is a very popular known figure. American master of lucid and cogent prose, wrote a lot of literature which is very simple to the Americans. So these were the five major important writers: William Bradford, John Winthrop, Cotton Mather, Jonathan Edwards, Benjamin Franklin. Remember, friends. Next, you can see, not until 1937, and when Edward Taylor's another important writer, Edward Taylor. Edward Taylor, he was another important able religious poet, okay, and during this colonial period of American literature. But and he is known to the world only after 1937, as usual. So first published from manuscript was Taylor discovered to have been able religious poet like metaphysical style. So Edward Taylor during this colonial period wrote literature that was religious in nature. And as metaphysical poets, and as you know, during 16th century, during Renaissance, and there were more than 30 important writers according to Dr. Johnson: John Donne, Andrew Marvell, Abraham Cowley, John Cleveland, George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, Richard Crusher, Thomas Traherne, the popular metaphysical poets of English literature, already we discussed. So what they wrote literature about religious. In the same way, this writer, Edward Taylor, wrote literature in American point of view. That is what Edward Taylor was, the metaphysical poet, one of the metaphysical poets of American literature, and who is known to the world only after 1937. Friends, you need to remember. Next, like Herbert and Crusher, another important writer, Anne Bradstreet, the chief colonial poet during this period, one of the most important colonial poets of the time, Anne Bradstreet, and she wrote a lot of literature about secular issues, domestic issues, and religious subjects. Okay, some basic issues. You may have a bit. Who was one of the important writers from American literature who wrote from the style of metaphysical poets? You need to remember the idea like Edward Taylor. And the popular colonial poet during the colonial period of American literature and a Broad Street. Like that, who of the following is one of the writers of colonial period? Maybe you may get. And the following is about what was the literature about. So you need to have certain important ideas in your mind when you read for examination. So friends, the publication in 1773. So poems on various subjects by Phillips Wheatley, very important slave narrative. So Phillips Wheatley, friends, this is very important. You could find more than half a dozen times once you refer to previous question papers of UGC-NET set examination across India. So Phillips Wheatley, who is so popular, 19-year-old slave, African slave, who was brought from Africa and made a slave in American continent. And after he was set free and where he started writing something about his own autobiographical issues, how he was, what, how he had a lot of problems as a slave, and he spoke in terms of his own personal reflections. That is considered to be slave narrative, and had been born in Africa, inaugurated long distinguished but until recently neglected line of black writers in America. The first black writer who was neglected and whose writings were neglected, but he was the first originated who wrote slave narratives, African slave narratives, Afro-American slave narrative, and one of the major important writers at the time, the just 19-year-old young man, Phillips Wheatley. Very important, my friends. And so during this period, colonial period, a lot of literature and who were brought from Africa to work in different fields, they wrote a lot of literature. That literature is considered to be slave narratives. Next, the period between the 1765 and 1790. So 1765, this is called the Stamp Act, and 1790, this is considered to be a revolutionary age. People revolted for freedom, independence, and as you know. So 1765 to 1790, a revolutionary age, another important significant date. Next, friends, it was a time during this period you could find a lot of issues like Thomas Paine's. Tom Paine, you know, Thomas Paine's revolutionary tracts, who wrote a lot of revolutionary political ideas, political essays, Tom Paine's in American literature. Thomas Jefferson's Statue of Virginia for Religious Freedom, another important tract, political tract, which influenced a lot of people of America and they revolted during the time. And Declaration of Independence, the colonial period, and Federalist Papers in support of the Constitution, most notably by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. So, who wrote a lot of Federalist Papers in support of American independence, in support of Declaration of Independence for America, mainly from 1765 to 1790, and the patriotic and satiric poems by Phillips and Freneau and Joel Barlow, and who wrote patriotic songs and satiric poems and for the sake of American. Next, this is what major important incidents. These are the major important writers of colonial period, friends. So you need to remember one of the major important writers at the time, Phillips Wheatley, and some of the other issues. And this is something about the colonial period, history of American literature, and the first period. And we'll talk about early national period maybe in the next class. See you guys.